when we take that context, when we take that stance, then we can continually and intentionally create trust and safety in our relationships because we understand that from moment to moment, we have a choice. Welcome back to another episode of Behind Beliefs, Behaviors, and the Brain, your communication podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Maisha. I'm very excited to be with you here today. Before I get too far into it, if you haven't already, go ahead and press that subscribe button. We want you to make sure that you're able to get every podcast. And I would absolutely love it if you would take a moment and write a review of the podcast, 5-star review of the podcast. This helps our listeners to know and to get the value that is coming into these podcasts. So if you would do that, and if you would share this podcast with someone else, I greatly appreciate it. So today we are talking about our thinking, and specifically the flexibility or rigidity of thinking. Now, I'm taking this today from a different context, and that is the context of physics. And I'm not going to go too deep into physics, but I want to share a couple of frameworks because I want you to really get the world of where we typically come from and historically why there's such rigidity inside of a lot of actions of society, of organizations, and how that translates to our thinking. And so we're going to explore that through a little bit of story around Newtonian versus Einsteinian thinking. Right now, I love Einstein. I love a lot of his quotes. And one of the things he says, one of my favorite quotes is, "No problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it." Okay. And so when we think about Newton versus Einstein, there are some distinct differences in thinking that I think that we can apply when we think about our own leadership, our own communication, and even creating psychological safety, creating trust. So the Newtonian framework is akin to a well-defined path, a predictable path that revolves around the principle that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Okay, so this is a deterministic worldview. And while it can be valuable for explaining physical phenomenon, it really falls short in capturing the complexities of human experience. So in the realm of interactions, Newtonian thinking emphasizes this sort of linear cause and effect relationship. And it suggests that everything unfolds in a very predictable manner following a predetermined sequence of actions and reactions. And we all know, and we used to say this in medical school when we would read textbooks about pathology, about the origin of disease and the progression of certain conditions or diseases, that people are not textbooks. And so we can say the same thing here. And so while there are actions and consequences, no doubt, actions have consequences, they're not always predictable, they're not always predetermined, and they're not always straightforward and linear. All right, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Butterfly Effect. Ashton Kutcher's this is a movie that came out a very long time ago, but it's based in the premise of the fact that every single decision in our life comes with multiple timelines and multiple outcomes. And in this movie, and not to do too many spoilers, it is the premise of someone attempting to go back in time and fix and change a certain outcome and the impact, the multiple impacts that has on the future. And if you're at all into sci-fi or things like Star Trek, and we talk about, and you've watched any shows or read any books that talk about time travel, you know that when you go back in time, you're not supposed to mess with anything because it could have that ripple effect. So in Newtonian thinking, there's this premise that everything is predictable and follows one linear path. Every action has an equal opposite reaction. Now, let's look at this in the real world. We look at Newtonian thinking, and when we look at Newtonian thinking, it is very much a fixed mindset. And when we look at it in the big picture, like organizationally, it can actually perpetuate oppressive systems because of its fixed framework that can inadvertently marginalize certain populations, right? And so Newtonian thinking is essentially very rigid thinking. So now let's contrast this. Let's contrast this with an Einsteinian paradigm of thinking or Einsteinian physics. Now, Einsteinian physics is marked by a shift from the mapped out path to uncharted territory. In the Einsteinian view of life, individuals and organizations are no longer passively following predefined trails, but they become active architects in their journey of life. And so this shift is akin to really exchanging that rigid map of thinking for a more versatile compass. In the Einsteinian paradigm, we can now view life as expansive, uncharted landscape where intentions set the directions. All right. So then that means that when we transition from this rigid framework, this rigid sort of Newtonian based framework, into this Einsteinian mindset, we're recognizing that we're all interconnected and that our well being is tied to the well being of others. Right. While the rigidity of Newtonian thinking isolates individuals and communities by emphasizing individualism and competition, which we know are characteristics of oppression, Einsteinian physics can foster connectedness and collaboration. So we still have a clear purpose in our quest, in our goals, in our intentions. But instead of waiting for a well trodden trail or defaulting to a well trodden trail, we actually take a different context and we take the case that we can pave the way, right? That we are the architects. We are the architects. We are actively shaping our destinies. We are actively involved in creating inspired action and creating platforms for dialogue, for cooperation, for collective problem solving. When we embrace the more Einsteinian paradigm, then we're embracing the context of building bridges instead of creating walls. Now, when we think about this practically, this can be a challenge because we do know that people like their patterns. People like the way we've always done things. People like that very predictable way of doing things. And this whole controversy started because back in 1905, Einstein proposed that light sometimes acts as a particle and sometimes acts as a wave. And whether it acted as a particle or whether it acted as a wave really depended on who was observing light. And so what that presupposed is that what this ultimately led to is the debate around the observer's ability to affect the outcome. The way the scientists observed light determined whether it acted as a particle or acted as a wave. That's observer bias. And so when we begin to think about this on a broader context, the fact that we could potentially impact outcomes simply in our thinking. And as you know, I talk a lot about cognitive bias and the fact that our thinking, our listening drives our thinking, and our thinking drives our behavior, right? So our listening drives our behavior ultimately. And so the reason this is challenging for people is because when we're comfortable with the predictable, when we're used to the predictable, when what we've been taught and raised on is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, that this is the way that it's done, this is the way it's always done. And someone presents an idea that, well, why is it done this way? How about just because it was done this way doesn't mean we always have to do it this way? Just because we have these policies and these policies have been in place for hundreds of years doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in place for the next 100 years. Just because we have communicated this way doesn't mean we have to continue to communicate this way. Just because we have thought this way or believed this way doesn't necessarily mean we have to continue to believe in a particular way. Just because you have had a particular view about a particular person or group of people doesn't mean you have to continue to have that particular view about that particular group of people. Just because your family has had a particular belief or view doesn't necessarily mean you need to carry that same belief and view forward. Beliefs can change, attitudes can change, and we can be the author of our reality. And it's something that when I did my TEDx talk, I talked about because of the filters that create our experience, our upbringing, what we've been taught and told, the societal filters. It can create rigidity in our thinking. It can create the Newtonianism in our thinking. And this is not just at the individual level. This is at the organizational level, at the community level, at the level of family. So why is this important for our communication? Because as I've said time and time again, it's our listening that drives our behavior. Our listening drives our behavior because we listen through these various filters and they feed into our thought processes. And so when we begin to become more aware of our thoughts and those thought processes, then we can begin to manipulate and shift those filters, begin to open those filters a little bit more so that we can see outside of our very narrow view. And what happens when we're communicating person to person and we catch ourselves in that rigidity of thinking, we can actually pause and put ourselves in a different position and see things from a different point of view. And that can impact how we listen and how we respond. I think one of the most important things that I will continue to emphasize is taking different perspectives. And I think that when we look at the paradigm of Einsteinian thinking and always taking the case that we are the authors and the architects of our thinking and of our lives, when we take that context, when we take that stance, then we can continually and intentionally create trust and safety in our relationships because we understand that from moment to moment, we have a choice. From moment to moment, we have a choice in how we listen and how we respond and how we interact and how we set boundaries and how we lead and how we parent. As you go about your week this week, think about these two contexts. Think about this rigid Newtonian thinking. And keep in mind, as I said before, there is utility for Newtonian physics because Newtonian physics helps helps to define our physical worlds, like the structure beams that hold up my house, right? Or that hold up the buildings that we live in. Newtonian physics is useful in that context. But in the context of human experience, it is not useful. It is rigid. So as you go out into the world this week, think about the contrast of rigid Newtonian physics and Newtonian thinking versus the more flexible Einsteinian paradigm of thinking, where we become the authors and the architects, and we're flexible and fluid, and we're taking perspective, and we're understanding that at any given moment, our observation can impact our outcome. All right. And so that is the weekly assignment. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to comment on this podcast. I'd love to hear thoughts on where you're applying Newtonian thinking, where you have noticed the rigidity of Newtonian thinking, where you have shifted into the flexibility of Einsteinian thinking, and where you struggle with that. Where do you struggle with that? Because there always is going to be our points of strength, and there may be points of opportunity for growth and development. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that. So go apply this in your life. And again, share this episode with a person in your life, a friend, a colleague, a family member. And if there is an episode or a topic, a communication topic or a topic on conflict or an empowerment topic that you'd like to see on this podcast, please feel free to email me at drmaisha@drmaisha.com. That's DRMAIYSHA at drmaisha.com. Same spelling. All right. So go out and have an amazing week and share this episode. And until the next time I see you, stay empowered.